Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to begin. Okay, sorry. Hello again. I'm Zulaikha, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce our next panel entitled Reading Forces. First with a lecture by Karen Barad entitled After the End of the World, Entangled, Nuclear Colonialism, Matters of Force, or not. There it is. Matters of Force and the Material Force of Justice, and is followed with a response by Daniela Gandorfer. Reading Forces raises questions of energy, agency, and other space-time matterings in relation to, at least, U.S. atomic bomb testing. Karen Barad is Professor of Feminist Studies, Philosophy, and History of Consciousness, and co-director of the Science and Justice Graduate Training Program at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Barad's Ph.D. is in theoretical particle physics and quantum field theory, and they hold a tenured appointment in a physics department before moving into more interdisciplinary spaces. Barad is the author of Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning, and numerous articles in the fields of physics, philosophy, science studies, poststructuralist theory, and feminist theory. Their research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Hughes Foundation, the Irvine Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Daniela Gandorfer is a Ph.D. candidate at the Department for Comparative Literature here at Princeton University. With a background in law as well as literature and media theory, Daniela is currently writing a dissertation on reading law, aiming to rethink law as well as reading by working through processes, philosophical and feminist materialist approaches to life, matter, space, and time. So I'm Zulaikha. I'm with Danielle and Mari, co-organizer of the conference, PhD student in architecture, architect through and through, essentially. Oh, and I really enjoy studying the atomic bomb. Is that good?
Okay, well, I bet everybody's totally jealous of me because I've gotten to work very closely already with two of the co-organizers who are phenomenal. These people have spent thousands of hours making this possible today, and I really want to thank all of you, all three of you, but also to give credit where credit is due for this paper. We've already had this wonderful conversation over Skype, and we've done diffractive readings of our work through one another. And so I just really have to thank them for their incisive comments and questions on my paper, and also to say that to the degree that this paper has force, it's due to the interaction of all three of us. So thank you. Also, before I begin, I just want to say something about the fact that I use a lot of slashes when I'm writing because they indicate to me an important thing about agential cuts. It's cutting together apart. So instead of keep saying slashes, which gets really boring to hear, like im/possibilities, I'll just do impossibilities. So that's how I'm going to pronounce the slash. Okay. At the core of quantum field theory, a theory of nature's transience, is the radical undoing of the separation between being and nothingness, and also the interruption of the temporality that Walter Benjamin calls homogeneous empty time. According to quantum field theory, time is out of joint. It is diffracted, broken apart, exploded, scattered about in multiple directions. Each moment is an infinite multiplicity with other moments within it. Now is not an infinitesimal slice, but an infinitely rich condensed node in a changing field diffracted across space-time. The first section of my paper is called Iraq 2003, Forces in Their Materiality. In January 2003, I gave a talk that began as follows. Well, the big day is here. Today is January 27th, the deadline for the weapons inspectors to report on the UN Security to report to the UN Security Council. Today is the deadline the Bush government has been pushing as the temporal line drawn in the sand, beyond which lies its justification for invading Iraq, failing convincing proof that the Iraqi government does not have weapons of mass destruction. But on some accounts, the US is already at war with Iraq as the littered remains of Desert Storm enact daily material assaults on the lives of the Iraqi people, including an assault that uses the remains of our nuclear weapons program. As Helen Caldicott explains, during the 1991 Gulf War, the United States deployed hundreds of tons of weapons, many of them anti-tank shells made of depleted uranium. The material is 1.7 times more dense than lead, and hence, when incorporated into anti-tank shell and fired, it achieves great momentum, cutting through tank armor like a hot knife through butter. What other properties does depleted uranium possess? First, it is pyrophorific. When it hits a tank at high speeds, it bursts into flames, producing tiny aerosolized particles less than 5 microns in diameter that are easily inhalable into the terminal air passages of the lung. Second, it is a potent radioactive carcinogen, emitting an alpha particle composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. Once inside the body, either in the lung if it has been inhaled, or in a wound if it penetrates flesh, or ingested since it concentrates in the food chain and contaminates water, it can produce cancer in the lungs, bones, blood, and kidneys. Third, it has a half-life of 4.5 billion years, meaning the areas in which ammunition was used in Iraq and Kuwait during the Gulf War will remain effectively radioactive for the rest of time. Children are 10 to 20 times more sensitive to the effects of radiation than adults. My fellow pediatricians in the Iraqi town of Basra, for example, are reporting an increase of 6 to 12 times in the incidence of childhood leukemia and cancer, yet because of the sanctions imposed upon Iraq by the United States and United Nations, they have no access to drugs or effective radiation machines to treat their patients, unquote. When the discourse of evil is incorporated into the bones of children, there is an implosion of nature and culture, human and non-human, subject and object, the material and the discursive, the local and the global that is made literal. The lives of the Iraqi people are already entangled, their bones shot through with the depleted, bankrupt policies of globalization. The waste products of our nuclear weapons program do not merely litter the landscape of Iraq, they are the enactment of a particular geopolitical policy which has reconfigured the sanitation, transportation, and communications infrastructures of many areas of Iraq and the blood and bones of Iraqi bodies. The discourse on terrorism is not some mere abstract idea that exists in position papers on the desks of government officials or in the contemporary cultural imagination, broadcast globally by US-based media. It lives through the specific materialized configurations of people's lives. The relationship between the local, the national, the regional, and the global is not a geometrical nesting relationship. They are interactively produced through one another in a topological reconfiguring that matters in the production of all bodies, all the way down to the levels of the very atoms and nature of being. Crucial to understanding the workings of power is an understanding of the nature of power in the fullness of its materiality. To restrict power's productive nature to the limited domain of the social, for example, or to figure matter as merely an end product rather than an active factor in further materializations, is to cheat matter out of the fullness of its capacity. How might we understand not only how human bodily contours are constituted through psychic processes, but how even the very atoms that make up the body come to matter, and more generally how matter makes itself felt? How do nuclear forces matter to the Iraqi children whose lives materialize in specific ways, in part because of the uranium atoms that are incorporated into their being? And how do social and other forces matter to the materialization of non-human bodies, including Iraq's infrastructure? Indeed, there are a host of material discursive forces, including ones that get labeled social, cultural, psychic, economic, natural, physical, biological, geopolitical, and geological, that may be important to particular entangled processes of materialization. If we follow disciplinary habits of tracing disciplinary defined causes through to the corresponding disciplinary defined effects, we will miss all the crucial interactions among these forces that fly in the face of any specific set of disciplinary concerns. As a physicist and as a feminist, I am committed to talking about nuclear forces, forces of nature, not just social forces, because nuclear forces, as well as social forces, matter to the workings of power. Introduction. Over the course of the years, I've been working my way back to where I started, returning to the questions that have always been with me and that continue to drive my work, the ones that drove me to become a student of the humanities in order to learn how to think rigorously about questions of justice while I followed my intellectual passions into the world of physics. Coming back to the questions I wrestled with as I began my graduate studies in physics and became involved in anti-nuclear and other activist work. How can I be responsible for that which I love in the face of its violent historical legacy and its continuing involvement in the military-industrial complex? Is there a way to do physics responsibly in the aftermath of the atom bomb? Is the field itself so utterly tainted by and saturated with violence that there is no possibility of subversive participation? If, as feminist science studies scholars have convincingly argued, ethical issues are not limited to the applications of scientific theories, but values are made together with facts inside the operations of what gets called pure science, then are the very practices of theorizing and experimenting caught up in war-making, capitalist projects of expansion and extraction, growth and development, such that they inevitably lead to the production of new forms of violence? How are its theories of space, time, and matter marked by gender, race, sexuality, nationalism, and colonialism? Can we find the traces of this violence even in its most abstract instantiations? And if this is so, are there nonetheless openings that exist within physics that might trouble its hegemony, its authority, its unapologetic epistemological imperialism that claims to cover over all of space, time, and matter? Is there a way to use physics' own insights to undermine its entanglement with colonizing practices? Indeed, is it possible that inside such practices we might find radical political imaginaries that are resources for survival rather than destruction, for justice rather than the perpetuation of violence? The dome. Let us begin again, for the first time, at the end, at an island that has been given the colonizing title, the end of the earth. Here we find a dome. The dome has been dubbed both an Edenic paradise and the most toxic place on earth. Here at the crossroads between nuclear and climate catastrophes is the end of the earth and the beginning. The dome is located in the Marshall Islands on a chain of islands called Enewetak Atoll. Few Americans have heard of this atoll, though some recall something about Bikini. Bikini Atoll is associated in the American imagination, if it is at all, with the first and only thermonuclear bomb test, but it was neither the first nor the only one, and aside from the bikini bathing suit, but of course that's connected. The particular thermonuclear hydrogen bomb test that got so much fanfare was 1,000 times the size of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The eerie sci-fi cloud of the Bravo test lingers, though the fact that it was one of 23 nuclear bombs exploded at Bikini has long faded. It's not that the 67 thermonuclear and nuclear and thermonuclear bombs that the U.S. detonated on the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1958 have been kept secret. On the contrary, unlike the Manhattan Project, much was made of this Cold War spectacle that turned the island nation into a laboratory and display case for the flexing of military muscle. But the extent of the violence and the ongoingness of what Winona LaDuke calls radioactive colonialism is one of the few things radioactive that has not been absorbed, or rather, like other forms of colonialism, the temporality of radioactive colonialism is not of a past that is past, or even decays with time, but rather an ongoingness that is present and that scrambles the imperialist temporal orderings of past, present, future. The majority of the 67 nuclear bombs, 43 of them were exploded on Eniwetok. 4 of Eniwetok's 40 islands were completely vaporized by thermonuclear bomb tests. 2 thermonuclear blasts left 2-kilometer-wide craters on the edge of Ruinit Island. In the 1970s, the U.S. government, in the process of washing its hands of the radioactive mess they left in the Marshall Islands, did a rudimentary cleanup. 4,000 U.S. servicemen were deployed to the Marshall Islands to do the dirty work, which included putting hundreds of pieces of plutonium, the debris of a detonation gone wrong, into plastic bags and throwing them into the crater, along with other nuclear debris from the tests. This constituted a cleanup of approximately 0.8% of the total radioactive waste. The servicemen had no protective gear or education about handling nuclear waste. The crater, which is made of coral, a very porous material, was then covered over by a concrete dome. Alcin Keelan, climate change activist and a native of Bikini Island, points out that the dome sits at the juncture, a crossroads between 2 great destructive forces. The dome, he says, is the connection between the nuclear age and the climate change age. For the Marshall Islands are at the forefront of climate change. A 60-centimeter increase in sea level by the end of the century may inundate 3/4 of the country. According to USGS data, many atolls in the Marshall Islands will be uninhabitable within decades. In a 2014 New York Times editorial, A Pacific Isle Radioactive and Forgotten, Columbia University climate change scholar Michael Gerard writes, in 1982, a U.S. National Research Council task force warned that the dome might be breached by a severe typhoon. But a 2013 report sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy saw no reason to worry. Quote, catastrophic failure of the concrete dome, it said, and instantaneous release of all its contents into the lagoon will not necessarily lead to any significant change in the radiation delivered to the local resident population, unquote. The reason, according to the report, was that the radiation inside the dome was dwarfed by the radiation in the sediments in the lagoon. Thus, a leak from the dome would be no added threat because it is dirtier on the outside than on the inside, unquote. Gerard continues, Ruinit Dome embodies injustices in many ways. The fact that all these weapons were exploded there, the fact that this plutonium was left behind, the fact that the U.S. military workers who worked there to clean up a failed plutonium bomb have not been compensated, and very importantly, the fact that the entire nation is endangered by sea level rise, which is caused mostly by the greenhouse gas emissions of the major emitting countries, of which the U.S. was historically number 1. These are an accumulation of injustices, unquote. We might add to Gerard's list the fact that the Marshallese have been and continue to suffer from very high rates of cancers as a result of radioactive fallout, the fact of severe birth defects that Marshallese women have given birth to what they call jellyfish and grapes. The fact that the Marshallese have the second highest rate of type 2 diabetes in the world as a result of eating Spam and other canned foods for decades after being told that the fish and fruits of the island were too contaminated to ingest. And the fact that the Marshallese, who've been allowed by the Compact of Free Association Treaty to move to the US and work without green cards but without citizenship, are currently the most impoverished ethnic group in the United States. The politics of matter, the matter of politics. Matter fell from grace during the 20th century. It became mortal. Very soon after that, it was murdered, exploded at its core, torn to shreds, blown to smithereens. The smallest of smallest bits, the heart of an atom, was broken apart with a violence that made the earth and the gods quake. In an instant, in a flash of light brighter than 1,000 suns, the distance between heaven and earth was obliterated. I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. There was a time when matter stood outside of time, but in the intervening years between the two world wars, physicists broke with a more than 1,000-year-old tradition inherited from the Greeks and placed matter in the hands of time. Quantum field theory, a mixture of quantum theory, relativity, and field theory, was responsible for this radical change in the order of things. Physicists began working on quantum field theory starting in the late 1920s, but quickly ran into difficulties, most seriously the so-called infinities problem, which was not resolved before the war. The war effort interrupted the development of the theory, at least in the West, because many of the same physicists who were hard at work on quantum field theory were called on to work on and take the lead on the development of new military technologies. This is not a coincidence. Nuclear physics developed alongside and inside, within quantum field theory. And many of the top physicists around the world were working on quantum field theory and nuclear physics. Skills, techniques, approaches to cracking hard problems, and more were traded back and forth between military research and the most abstract efforts in theoretical physics. In significant ways, the war effort for physicists around the globe was continuous with their work in pure theoretical physics. Tracing the entanglements of the construction of quantum field theoretic account of nature and the development of a weapon that unleashed nature's fury goes to the core of this project, a project that I've been working on for some time now. But for now, for today, I'm going to focus on exploring the radical possibilities that exist within the theory for exploding the structures of violence that not only resulted from the theory, but were integral to the practice of theorizing. Quantum physics provides useful conceptual tools for understanding the politics of matter and the matter of politics in the nuclear age. It is because quantum physics and the atom bomb are directly and profoundly entangled. The theory and the bomb inhabit and help constitute each other. Just like the ontology or hauntology it suggests, quantum theory is shot through with the political. This is why it might be useful. The next section is called Quantum Field Theory, Life and Death, Time, Being, and the Structure of Nothingness. During this time, the nature of time and being were together remade. No longer an independent parameter, relentlessly marching forward into the future, time is neither a continuum nor a series of discrete moments that follow in succession. Time is diffracted, imploded, exploded in on itself. Each moment made up of a superposition of all moments, differently weighted and combined in their specific material entanglement. And directly linked to this indeterminacy of time is a shift in the nature of being and nothingness. Newtonian physics subscribes to the Democritan notion that nature has but two elements, atoms and the void. In classical Newtonian physics, the void is mere nothingness. It is that which literally doesn't matter. The void provides a backdrop against which that which matters, namely matter, can be mapped in space and time, where space and time are absolute, universal, fixed homogeneous coordinates that have their existence independently of all matter and of each other. And matter, discrete bits of substance, are immutable. These bits can move about and change their motion according to the application of forces that are external to the bits of inert matter. Newton's equations are designed to account for their motion. Motion unfolds predictably against the backdrop of absolute space, while time marches forward without regard for anyone or anything. In this way, the very nature of change is theorized as matter in motion, where the movement is determined by the whims of external forces. 20th century physics challenges these notions of space, time, and matter and the void. According to quantum field theory, matter is not some givenness that pre-exists its interactions, and the void is not determinately empty. Indeed, matter is always already caught up with the indeterminate dynamics of nothingness of the void. At the core of quantum theory is the indeterminacy of time and being, time being, and this gives rise to the fact that nothingness is not empty, but on the contrary is flush with the dynamism of indeterminacy of time being, the play of the non-presence of non-existence. As a result of a primary ontological indeterminacy, the void is not nothing while not being something, but rather a desiring orientation towards being, becoming, innumerable imaginings of what might yet be, have been. Nothingness is material even in its non-presence. So-called virtual particles are the quanta of the indeterminate play of nothingness. They are and are not as a result of the energy-time indeterminacy relation. Virtual particles are quantized indeterminacies in action. Virtual particles are not present and not present, but they are material. In fact, most of what matters is virtual. Virtual particles do not traffic in a metaphysics of presence. They do not exist in space and time. They are ghostly non-existences that teeter on the edge of the infinitely fine blade between being and non-being. Virtuality is admittedly difficult to grasp. Indeed, this is its very nature. Virtuality is the material wanderings of nothingness, where every possible path is tested out. Virtuality is the ongoing thought experiment the world performs with itself. Indeed, quantum field theory tells us that the void is an endless exploration of all possible couplings of virtual particles, a scene of wild activities. The quantum vacuum is more like an ongoing questioning of the nature of emptiness than anything like a lack. The ongoing questioning of itself, and indeed of it and self, is what generates, or rather is, the structure of nothingness. The vacuum is no doubt doing its own experiments with non-being. Indeterminacy is not the state of a thing, but an unending dynamism. The fact that the void is not empty, mere lack or absence matters. The question of absence is surely as political as that of presence. When has absence ever been an absolute givenness? Is it not always a question of what is seen, acknowledged, and counted as present, and for whom? The void, a much valued apparatus of colonialism, a crafty, insidious imaginary, a way of offering justification for claims of ownership in the discovery of virgin territory, the notion that untended, uncultivated, uncivilized spaces are empty rather than plentiful has been a well-worn tool used in the service of colonialism, racism, capitalism, militarism, imperialism, nationalism, and scientism. This next section is called Quantum Field Theory, a Touchy Subject. Birth and death, it turns out, are not the sole prerogative of the animate world. So-called inanimate beings also have finite lives. Quote, "Particles can be born and particles can die," explains one physicist. In fact, it is a matter of birth, life, and death that requires the development of a new subject in physics, that of quantum field theory. Quantum field theory is a response to the ephemeral nature of life. When it comes to quantum field theory, it is not difficult to find trouble: epistemological trouble, ontological trouble, a troubling of kinds, of identities, of the nature of touching and self-touching, of being and time, to name a few. It is not so much that trouble is around every corner. According to quantum field theory, it inhabits us and we inhabit it, or rather, trouble inhabits everything and nothing, matter and the void. How does quantum field theory understand the nature of matter? Pace Democritus, particles do not take their place in the void. Rather, they are constitutively inseparable from it. And as we just saw, the void is not vacuous. It is a polyrhythmic, structured nothingness, a dynamic play of the indeterminacy of non-being. The void, or what quantum physicists call the vacuum, is an extravagant, inexhaustible exploration of virtuality, where virtual particles are having a field day performing experiments in being in time. Let us start with the electron, one of the simplest particles. According to classical physics, it is a point particle, a particle of 0 dimensions, and therefore devoid of structure. So the top diagram is just supposed to be indicating an electron just moving forward in time. Not very interesting. Now, even the simplest bit of matter causes all kinds of difficulties for quantum field theory. For as a result of the time-being indeterminacy, the electron does not exist as an isolated particle, but is always already inseparable from the unruly activities of the vacuum. In other words, the electron is always already interacting with the virtual particles of the vacuum in all possible ways. So, for example, if we look at the second diagram, the electron will emit a virtual photon, which is the carrier of the electromagnetic force, and then reabsorb it. This possibility is understood as the electron electromagnetically interacting with itself, that is, touching itself, since touch is but an electromagnetic interaction, and photons are the quanta of the electromagnetic field. So part of what an electron is then, according to this quantum field theory, is its self-interaction. But this exchange of a photon with itself is not a process that happens in isolation either. All kinds of more involved things can and do occur in this frothy virtual soup of indeterminacy that we ironically think of as a state of pure emptiness. For example, in addition to the electron exchanging a virtual photon with itself, that is, touching itself, it is possible that that virtual photon to enjoy other interactions with itself. For example, the virtual photon can metamorphize or transition, change its identity. So here I'm talking about the bottom diagram. So, for example, an electron can emit a virtual photon that then transforms into a virtual electron-positron pair that subsequently annihilate each other and morph back into a single virtual photon before it is reabsorbed by the electron. And a positron is what's called an antiparticle. It's the anti-electron, which has the same mass but the opposite charge and travels backwards in time. Anyway, there are an infinite number of these diagrams that one can write down. And so I'm just calling that the and so on of quantum field theory. So this and so on is shorthand for an infinite set of possibilities involving every possible kind of interaction with every possible kind of virtual particle it can interact with. That is, there is a virtual exploration of every possibility, and this infinite set of possibilities, or the infinite sum of histories, entails a particle touching itself, and the particle that transmits the touch transforming itself, and then that touching itself and transforming and touching other particles that make up the vacuum, and so on ad infinitum, an alchemical orgy of sorts. Not everything is possible given a particular interaction, but an infinite number of possibilities exist. Every level of touch, then, is itself touched by all possible others. Particle self-interactions entail particle transitions from one kind to another in a radical undoing of kinds, queer transformations or transmutations. Hence, the electron is an encounter with the infinite alterity of the self. Matter is an infolding, an involution. It cannot help touching itself, and in this self-touching, it comes in contact with the infinite alterity that it is. Polymorphous perversity raised to an infinite power. Talk about queer trans intimacy. What is being called into question here is the very nature of the self. And in terms of not just being, but also time. That is, in an important sense, the self is dispersed, diffracted through time and being. Commenting specifically on the electron self-energy interaction, the physicist Richard Feynman, who won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to developing quantum field theory, as well as being a chief scientist who helped engineer the Manhattan Project, expressed horror at the electron's monstrous nature and its perverse ways of engaging with the world. Quote, "Instead of going from one point to another, the electron goes along for a while and suddenly emits a photon. Then, horror, it absorbs its own photon. Perhaps there's something immoral about that, but the electron does it," unquote. This self-energy, self-touching term has been labeled a perversion of the theory because the circulation of the self-energy, the calculation of the self-energy contribution is infinite, which is an unacceptable answer to any question about the nature of the electron, such as what is its mass or its charge. Apparently touching oneself or being touched by oneself, the ambiguity, undecidability, indeterminacy may itself be a key to the trouble, is not simply troubling, but here we see it is a moral violation, the very source of all the trouble. The problem of self-touching, especially self-touching the other, is a perversity of quantum field theory that goes far deeper than we can touch on here. But the gist of it is this. This perversity that is at the root of an unwanted infinity that threatens the very possibility of calculability gets renormalized, obviously. Right? What else would we expect? Okay? So how does this happen? Physicists conjectured that there are two different kinds of infinities or perversions involved in this case. One has to do with self-touching and another has to do with nakedness, which I think is very, very interesting considering Bikini Atoll and the notion of the bikini and what gets covered up. And so right now I'm in the process of trying to trace that language and see its origins. Anyway, so in addition to the infinity related to self-touching, there is an infinity associated with what gets called the bare point particle. I'm using technical language here. That is, with the metaphysical assumption we started with that there is only an electron, the undressed bare electron, and the void are separate from the void and the electron are separate from one another. So renormalization is the systematic cancellation of infinities, an intervention based on the idea that the subtraction of different size infinities can be a finite quantity. Perversion eliminating perversion. The cancellation idea is this. The infinity of the bare point particle cancels the infinity associated with the cloud of virtual particles. So in this way, the bare point particle is dressed by the vacuum contributions, that is, by the cloud of virtual particles. And the dressed electron, the electron in drag, that is the physical electron, is thereby renormalized, that is made normal or finite. So all of that is technical language, except I took a little liberty with the drag part. So renormalization is the mathematical handling or taming of these infinities. That is, the infinities are subtracted from one another, yielding a finite answer. Mathematically speaking, this is a tour de force. Conceptually, it is a queer theorist's delight. It shows that all of matter in its essence, and of course that is precisely what's being troubled here. is a massive overlaying of perversities, an infinity of infinities. So to summarize, quantum field theory radically deconstructs the ontology of classical physics. The starting point ontology of particles in the void, a foundational reductionist essentialism, is undone by quantum field theory. According to quantum field theory, perversity and monstrosity lie at the core of being, or rather it is threaded through it. All touching entails an infinite alterity, so that touching the other is touching all others, including the self, and touching the self is a matter of touching the stranger within. Even the smallest bits of matter are an unfathomable multitude. Each individual always already includes all possible interactions with itself through all possible virtual others, including those and itself that are non-contemporaneous with itself. That is, every finite being is always already threaded through with an infinite alterity diffracted through being and time. Indeterminacy is an undoing of identity that unsettles the very foundations of being and non-being. The void and its dynamics of indeterminacy mark an interruption, an undoing of self. The outside, the void allegedly surrounding all matter, is constitutively inside matter itself. So this next section is called Of Hospitality. In an important report on the fallout, the hardship, pain, suffering, and damages that resulted from the U.S. nuclear weapons test on the Marshall Islands, the authors of Consequential Damages of Nuclear War, the Rongelap report by Barbara Rose Johnson and Holly M. Barker write, the Rongelap report tells the story of a myriad of changes that occur to a community whose lives and lands are heavily contaminated with radioactive fallout. In 1946, after evacuating the people of Bikini and nearby atoll communities in the Marshall Islands, the United States detonated 2 atomic weapons, the same type of bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki in 1945, the plutonium bomb. In 1947, the United Nations designated the Marshall Islands as a U.S. trust territory. And over the next 11 years, this U.S. territory played host to another 65 atmospheric, atomic, and thermonuclear tests. The largest of these tests, codenamed Bravo, was detonated on March 1st, 1954. The 150 megaton hydrogen bomb was purposefully exploded close to the ground. It melted huge quantities of coral atoll, sucking it up and mixing it with radiation released by the weapon before depositing it on the islands and inhabitants in the form of radioactive fallout, unquote. Well, there's so much to talk about in this paragraph. Just for starters, there is the stunning temporality of the establishment of this trust, whereby the UN designates the U.S. as trustee of the Marshall Islands after the U.S. exploded 2 nuclear bombs there in 1946. But for now, I'd like to focus on a phrase that stands out for its irony and leaves the reader tripping at the threshold of its invitation to examine it further. So this phrase is played host. Over the next 11 years, the U.S. territory played host, they're saying, right? This is not an insignificant phrasing. This playing at being a host, not being a host, but playing at it, seems to point to a troubling of the legitimacy of the host. Indeed, it seems that it is in the nature of the idiom itself that playing host seems to call the question on actually being a host. Tripping over the threshold of this phrasing, we cannot not ask, who is hosting whom? Zooming out a bit, but staying with the same uncanny sentence, what cannot go without notice is the horrifying nature of this particular welcome. Again, the quote, this U.S. territory played host to another 65 atmospheric, atomic, and thermonuclear tests, unquote. In other words, on a literal reading of this sentence, the host was a territory, was a territory given to one entity by another entity to whom it didn't belong. The territory in question was legally designated as belonging to the U.S., by an institution dealing in international law. And who were the guests? They were none other than another 65 nuclear and thermonuclear bombs. Talk about hospitality. The idiom of playing host here not only calls the question of who it is that is doing the hosting, by proxy the US, but also points to the performative nature of the ghastly repetitions of incalculable violence that constitute the host as host. Hence, the notion of playing at hosting harkens to the multiple and compounding injustices, or rather a superposition of injustices that result from this so-called hospitality, including but not limited to the permanent uninhabitability, that is, the made inhospitable nature of the very islands that were interpolated into this role. Clearly, the reference to this unconventional and explosive relationship of alleged hospitality, or indeed hostility, which Derrida notes is etymologically inside the very definition of hospitality, begs a very important question that takes us to the ethical core of relations among entities, whether individuals or nation states. What is the basis for playing host? What are the conditions of possibility for hosting? Indeed, does not the very notion of hosting, of being a host rather than playing host, entail some privileged relation to place, to a specific place whereby one welcomes guests? And what constitutes an ethical and just relation of hospitality? As Derrida points out, hospitality figured in the classic sense, the law-governed conditional sense, is always already a matter of violence and injustice. Derrida explains, no hospitality in the classic sense without sovereignty of oneself over one's home, but since there is also no hospitality without finitude, sovereignty can only be exercised by filtering, choosing, and thus excluding and doing violence. Injustice, a certain injustice, and even a certain perjury, begins right away from the very threshold of the right to hospitality, unquote. So hence, while the classic sense of hospitality raises vital questions of place and the relation to place, as well as that of sovereignty, which are no doubt relevant here, indeed of critical importance, Derrida warns about a kind of hostility, even violence, inside hospitality so conceived. But are not the acts of extreme violence that the authors of the passage allude to of a different order than those of which Derrida speaks? The fact that the author's naming of acts of extreme violence as that of playing host is not merely ironic, but at once announces the questions of place and sovereignty, while at the same time calling into question the very notion of hospitality itself, at least figured in a classic sense, thereby revealing the irony at its core. If we follow Derrida on hospitality, he likens the important distinction between law and justice to that of conditional and unconditional hospitality, respectively. Unlike law, which is instrumentalized in terms of norms, interpretations, and calculations, justice is the experience of the incalculable, of having to calculate with the incalculable. It is at play in those singular moments where we cannot determine the outcome or just decision in a given situation, not only because there is no given rule to be applied, but because the rules in their very basis are in question, unquote. So justice is therefore always to come, as Derrida says, and he emphasizes this in an essay called Force of Law. And this is not to say that we can therefore absolve ourselves from the responsibility to actively pursue justice. He makes this very clear. On the contrary, justice is in the form of justice to come is an infinite pursuit, an ongoing ethical practice. Indeed, in this case, it is abundantly evident, explosively so, that the law is not an antidote to injustices, that legal redress is not only not sufficient to block or address the harm, but on the contrary, it is the law itself that is doing violence, but not merely by defining terms and giving interpretations, which is Derrida's focus, but a legally sanctioned means of applying a force so great that it literally vaporized islands. This is precisely the kind of material, indeed explosive violence of the law that I think Benjamin sets out to address in his critique of violence. This brings to the fore a crucial question. How hospitable is hospitality, even in its unconditional form, for addressing questions of violence? Not merely the violence of choosing, but the unleashing of the forces of nature. These forces of violence are surely not of the same order, let alone of the same magnitude. Which brings us back around to the sentence we've been focusing on that has the US territory playing host to the guests who are nuclear bombs. Surely this ironic turn of phrase is a purposeful displacement and grotesque distortion of the actual historical host-guest relationship entailed in what is also nothing less than a deep perversion of the notion of hospitality. For was it not the Marshallese people whose hospitality goes unmentioned and yet at the same time is forcibly performed for the world in staged newsreels made by the US Navy? As Jeffrey Sasha Davis points out, the Bikinians were asked, that is forced, to leave their island, quote unquote, for the good of mankind. At the time of the Bikinians' removal, the US Navy and the US media constructed the Bikinians as a primitive, nomadic people living in nature who could legitimately be moved to any other natural atoll. This labeling of the atoll as natural served to erase the social history of the Bikinian people in their place. So the question of hospitality is far from beside the point, and yet it leaves us with the crucial question, how can we understand hospitality so that it can meaningfully address a situation such as this, where violence is not about choosing and filtering, but where a great force of nature has been unleashed? This is not to dismiss Derrida out of hand. Derrida's stakes in raising this question are quite high. It is in the context of his discussions of immigration, political asylum, statelessness, deportation, incarceration, refugeeism, xenophobia, and nationalism that Derrida asks if hospitality is possible and what it might mean. Surely these issues could not be more important at this moment of time, robustly entangled as they are to nuclear and climate issues. We are here at the crossroads, as has so often been the case. Indeed, when has it not? And yet, we can see from this example that the question of hospitality, if it is to take account of the material nature of these forces of violence, must be asked in relation to the question of justice. It is insufficient to draw a parallel or an analogy between hospitality and justice, or even to too quickly equate them through a transitive relation whereby both hospitality and justice are said to define or be equated with deconstruction itself. And this is a point that Daniela made in our discussions. So this next section is called Quantum Physics and Entangled Relations of Responsibility. Significantly, the Marshallese refuse the name dome and have named this concrete structure the tomb. Tombs contain one's ancestors. This tomb contains, and doesn't contain, the future as well as the past. It marks an untimeliness, a time out of joint. The structure of this covered over void, blasted into a void, this nothingness is a hauntology, an inheritance of practices of erasure and avoidance. This nothingness is flush with alchemical wanderings, the infinite ongoing reiterative transformations of time being. While hauntings are understood by some as one or another form of subjective human experience, the epistemological revivifications of the past, a recollection through which the past makes itself subjectively present, according to quantum field theory, Hauntings are material. They are lively indeterminacies of time being, materially constitutive of matter itself, indeed of everything and nothing in their inseparability. Hauntings that are not mere rememberings of a past assumed to be left behind in actuality, but rather the dynamism of ontological indeterminacy of time being in its materiality. Furthermore, as I have elaborated in a paper entitled Troubling Times and Ecologies of Nothingness, Returning, Remembering, and Facing the Incalculable, which sets out to explore justice to come as a material set of impossibilities within and of the world, an embodied practice of tracing the entanglements of violent histories, I argued that in the face of colonial practices of erasure and avoidance, such as those that we find in the histories and ongoing lived realities of violence that entangles Nagasaki to the indigenous lands of the American Southwest, the pursuit of justice entails an embodied practice of remembering, which is not about going back to what was, but rather about the material reconfigurings of space-time mattering in ways that attempt to do justice to account for the devastation wrought, as well as to produce openings, new possible histories by which time beings might find ways to endure. In my continuing project of working to bring forward the radical possibilities for living being otherwise that are always already within quantum physics, I have also written about quantum entanglements in relation to ontological relations of inheritance. It is worth keeping these points concerning the material questions of justice when we turn our attention back to questions of hospitality in light of the insights that we have learned about quantum field theory. So I just want to remember some of that from a paper from 2010 published in Derrida Today. Only by facing the ghosts in their materiality and acknowledging injustice without the empty promise of complete repair, of making amends finally, can we come close to hearing their silent speaking, their speaking silence. The past is never closed, never finished once and for all, but there is no taking it back, setting time aright, putting the world back on its axis. There is no erasure finally. The trace of all configurings are written into the iterative, enfolded materializations of what was, is to come. Time can't be fixed. To address the past and future, to speak with ghosts, is not to entertain or reconstruct some narrative of the way it was, but to respond, to be responsible, to take responsibility for that which we inherit from the past and from the future, for the entangled relationalities of inheritance that we are, to acknowledge and be responsive to the non-contemporaneity of the present, to put oneself at risk, to risk oneself, which is never one or self, to open oneself up to the indeterminacy in moving towards what is to come. Only in this ongoing responsibility to the entangled other, without dismissal, without enough already, is there the possibility of justice to come, unquote. Conclusion. The concluding section is called Radical Hospitality and the Material Force of Justice. Let us return to the dome, a slab of concrete covering over a void that was blasted into the midst of a void. That is, it was a void in the eyes of the US government, which viewed the Marshall Islands as, quote unquote, uninhabited or nearly so. An untouched paradise marked as infinitely distant from the modern technological world in space and in time. Then there is the void created by the detonation of a nuclear bomb, a crater, a bit of nothingness blasted into the void that is the island of Runit, a void within a void. And then there is the literal cover-up, the pouring of concrete on top of the void, a conscious attempt at avoidance of responsibility following on the heels of the dumping of plutonium and other radioactive materials into the void. Uninhabitability, inhabiting the uninhabited, a tomb inhabited by ghosts. This covering over, this attempt to dress up the naked infinities of the layering of violence upon violence, the incalculable brutality of superpositions of nuclear and climate catastrophes, the effects of militarism, colonialism, nationalism, scientism, modernism, racism, and capitalism, speaks to the specific structures of nothingness in their entanglement. In this case, a void within a void at the end of the earth in space that signals the end of the earth in time. Colonialism often finds its justification in terms of the void, that which is deemed uninhabited and uninhabitable, as Sylvia Wynter points out, with its alleged invitation to colonial habitation or colonial uninhabitability, as the case may be, and the consequent avoidance of responsibility. Radioactive colonialism manufactured in the form of a structured nothingness, a nothingness alive with ghosts, an island void whose whose non-human inhabitants include a piece of a bomb that broke with its violent inheritance by breaking itself apart rather than exploding on command, lives inside that crater that its kin created. Questions of cohabitation cohabit with those of uninhabitability, a strange hospitality. Which brings us back around to the question raised earlier, how hospitable is hospitality for addressing questions of violence, not merely the violence of choosing, delineating, interpreting, and defining on behalf of the law, but the extreme violence entailed in unleashing the forces of nature. Derrida, in On Hospitality, deconstructs the juridical, aka conditional notions of hospitality, and in particular its foundations and notions of property and the sovereign self. That is, he demonstrates how a notion of hospitality founded on these Eurocentric notions of self and relatedly that of property entail their undoings. Perhaps one of the most telling sentences that Derrida writes about hospitality is in the form of a question. Is not hospitality an interruption of the self? Echoing, I think, the bomb's interruption of itself. The self is constituted through the incorporation of the other within itself. The other erupts within, through, as the constitution and deconstitution of the self. Turning to Emmanuel Levinas to further articulate this point, Derrida writes, because it opens itself too, so as to welcome the eruption of the idea of infinity in the finite, this metaphysics is an experience of hospitality, unquote. Is this not what we have learned that quantum field theory says of matter itself? Is not matter a matter of hospitality in its very constitution, in its very undoing of itself? Is there not an eruption of the infinite within the finite, an intrusion of an unlimited number of unknown others to an unlimited extent, such that the nature of matter entails in its very structure the undoing of identity, individuality, essence? According to quantum field theory, there is no avoiding the fact that the void is far from empty. Indeed, nothingness is an infinite plenitude, not a thing, but a dynamic of ontological indeterminacy that cannot be discontinued from what matters. Hence, according to quantum field theory, even the smallest bits of matter are an enormous multitude. Each individual is made of all possible histories of virtual interactions with all others. Or rather, according to quantum field theory, there is no such thing as a discrete individual with its own roster of properties. In fact, the other, the constitutively excluded, is always already within. The very notion of the self is a troubling of the interior-exterior distinction. Matter, in the indeterminacy of its being, undoes identity and unsettles the very foundations of non-being. Together with Derrida, we might then say identity can only affirm itself as identity to itself by opening itself to the hospitality of a difference from itself or a difference with itself. Condition of the self, such a difference from and with itself, would then be its very thing, the stranger at home, unquote. So what is being called into question here is the very nature of the self. All selves are not themselves, but rather the iterative intraactivity of all matter of time beings. The self is dispersed, diffracted through being and time. In an undoing of the inside-outside distinction, it is undecidable whether there is an implosion of otherness within or a dispersion, explosion of self throughout space-time mattering. While for Levinas, the stakes are the ethical constitution of the human subject, quote, submitting subjection to the idea of infinity in the finite, unquote, what we find here is that this structure of hospitality is a matter of the very matter of itself in an undoing of it and self, and not limited to the human. Indeed, in an important sense, this structured relationality precedes the differential constitution of the human in opposition to some other. In other words, what is at issue here is not a matter of extending the range of Levinas's thinking or his conclusions to the non-human or the otherwise or more than human, but rather it is in the very nature of nature's radical hospitality that the constitutive outside of the otherwise than being erupts within the self. And this dynamism of ontological indeterminacy precedes and undoes any delineation, including that of the human. In an important sense, then, a notion of radical hospitality coming through quantum field theory breaks open not only some alleged pre-existing distinction between human and its others, but also the very walls of deconstruction circumscription within the limits of discourse. For as Derrida says in Force of Law, quote, discourse here meets its limit in itself, in its very performative power. There is here a silence walled up in the violent structure of the founding act. Walled up, walled in, because this silence is not exterior to language, unquote. Now, not only does the dynamism of indeterminacy undo any such walling up or walling in, but it is always already in touch with matter, or rather it is a matter in its inseparability from the speaking silence of the void, not some walled-in silence. The fact that this structure of hospitality is not limited to the human, but rather is in the very nature of nature is vitally important. For it means that the self, or should we say itself, which is not itself, is not merely interrupted by human others, but also a host of other others, including ontological relationalities of inheritance and the ontological wanderings of nothingness. In the example we've been discussing, this would include the eruptions of the forces of capitalism, colonialism, militarism, etc., but also an infinite set of possibilities for their undoings. This is no small matter. Inside the nucleus of the atom is an implosion of violent legacies, sedimenting historicities of colonialism, racism, extractivist capitalism, militarism, neocolonialism, and also the seeds of their downfall and the possibilities for living and dying otherwise. The classical Newtonian notion of the void might have served as a much valued apparatus in the service of colonialism, but according to quantum field theory, the void is not the background against which something happens, something matters, something appears, but rather an active constitutive part of everything. As such, even the smallest bits of matter are haunted by, indeed constituted by, the indeterminate alchemical wanderings of an infinity of possible time beings, a radical hospitality, an unlimited number of unknown others to an unlimited extent. According to quantum field theory, matter is an ongoing transmutation, an undoing of self, of identity, where the other is always already within. Matter is a matter of hospitality, the impossibility of radical hospitality in its very constitution and its very undoing of itself. Now, given this point about matter, together with what we've also learned about matter as a matter of justice, that is, justice in its materiality, it is not the case that matters of justice and matters of hospitality are to be understood as analogous or parallel or equivalent concepts. Rather, matters of justice together with those of hospitality as radical hospitality are structurally related material fields and forces. Each bit of matter, each moment of space-time mattering is shot through with an infinite set of possibilities for materially reconfiguring worlds and past, future, presents. For these are matters of justice. Is this not the mark of the force of justice that is written into the fabric of the world? Which is not to say that the world is always already just by its very nature, but rather to say that there is a force of justice that is available within every moment, every place, every bit of matter. For therein lies the infinite possibilities for defeating the entangled forces of violence and for imagining and bringing forth what comes after the end of the world, that is, in the aftermath of the downfall of a multitude of entangled structures of violence that must be brought to an end. Entire worlds inside each point, each specifically configured. In the case at hand, there is an implosion of world politics, devastation, dispossession, displacement, nuclear and climate refugeeism inside a tiny island nation. After the end of the world, final paragraph. Everybody's going, yay, okay. After the end of the world of capitalism, militarism, racism, the ending of these structures of violence, even if realized only locally and momentarily, if only for the time being, in the aftermath of the downfall of hegemonic ways of thinking founded on the binarism of us-them, when instead of drawing lines in the sand, the practice will have been, is one, of looking to the wind, like the Marshallese indigenous practice of wave piloting, riding the diffraction patterns of differencing, guiding us along alternative paths, transformative alchemical wonderings. This is an invitation to a practice of radical hospitality and opening up to all that is possible in the thickness of the now, in rejecting practices of avoidance, taking responsibility for injustices, activating and aligning with forces of justice, and welcoming the other in an undoing of the colonizing notion of selfhood, rather than as a marker of not us, not me. Thank you.
Before launching into my response, I want to first express my deep gratitude to Karen, not only to their powerful talk just now, but also for how their scholarship, in its remarkable inventiveness and precision, has been nothing short of transformative for me and the kinds of works I seek to do. Sharing this panel with Karen today is an especially high honor. In this response, I want to focus on what theory, perhaps even reading theory, can do, something that Karen has taught me through their work and our conversations. Let me start responding to this talk by taking up a reference and going back 29 years, namely to Force of Law, a talk Jacques Derrida has delivered at the Cardozo Law School in 1989 as part of the colloquium entitled Deconstruction and the Possibility of Justice. It is, of course, a rich text and also a controversial one. But what is most interesting in this context is that it is here that Derrida not only utters most openly his frustration about how deconstruction has been appropriated, often even by the most perverse calculation, but also his hope for a certain deconstruction, namely one that intervenes in an efficient and responsible way in both the profession but also in the world. If this kind of deconstruction had a disciplinary locus, he states, it would be critical legal studies, for it is therein that the deconstructivist interrogation brings forth the necessary problematization of law and justice exactly by destabilizing and complicating categories like property, subject, legal subject, intentionality, and justice. In regards to the developments in critical legal studies, he writes, and this would be the first slide, they respond, it seems to me, to the most radical programs of a deconstruction that would like, in order to be consistent with itself, not to remain enclosed in purely speculative, theoretical, academic discourses, but rather to aspire to something more consequential, to change things and to intervene in an efficient and responsible, though always, of course, very mediated way, not only in the profession, but more generally, the world. Situating this discussion in the realm of law and justice reveals the stakes of theory, of its violence and its potential. If it were radical enough, deconstruction, which is, we learn, justice and hospitality, would leave discourses that are purely speculative and theoretical. Despite Derrida's aims to articulate a style of deconstruction that occupies itself with the world, with what is living beyond the human, his imagination of force in force of law nevertheless remains metaphorical, immaterial, and unlocalized. Oh, you cannot find it. He argues that the performative force implied by the very emergence of justice and law is an interpretive force, that is one concerned with the production of meaning detached from matter. Not only are law and justice groundless, deconstruction cannot actually take place. Indeed, in order for deconstruction to do its trick, that is, to complicate and challenge naturalized meanings, the process of signification needs to be ruptured, and meaning has to be set free and detached from matter, so that it is out of touch, freely circulating, wildly met with and as language. Paradoxically, this kind of deconstruction, despite Derrida's attempts to push it further, hits its limits precisely in force of law, where discourse and language come up against the limit, where, as John Protevi puts it, the impossibility of the conceptual explication of the interweaving of force and signification finds its expression in silence. This is also the passage Karen was referring before with the being walled in. I say paradoxically because it is as if Derrida has conceptually walled in not only the violent foundation of the force of law, but also the silence that announces the limit of a certain kind of deconstruction, namely one that concerns itself with meaning detached from and superior to matter. Barad's reading, in its particular ethically informed mode of doing theory, shows that this paradoxical moment is not an aporia of theory, but rather an impasse that requires the breaking free from what Deleuze and Guattari describes as imperialism of language, that is, the tyranny of the signifier and its function as universal translator or interpreter. It is silence that expresses and comes to matter differently, precisely because it is neither lack nor absence nor nothingness of speech, but an expression that belongs to a different order and resists the dynamics of the signifier signified and interpreter interpretation. Forms of expressions and the various social and natural forces that enable and enact them matter. The electron, as Barad shows, carries infinite possibilities of expressing itself interactively, including emitting a photon and actualizing from an infinite set of possibilities involving every possible kind of interaction with every possible kind of virtual particle it can interact with. Or the atomic bomb, which expresses itself not only in its detonation, but in the thermal burns upon human skin, the radioactive particles of fallout in the atmosphere and on the ground, the flash of light of 1,000 suns, the deformation and replication of DNA that continuously produces copies and mutate into cancer, and the craters of multiple ground zeros that litter the Earth from Inuwatak to Mitushika Bay. Each of these events carry a multitude of events within. Injustices eventually find their expression. But can justice? As Barad has just argued, yes. But justice not as a concept or rupture and signification processes, but justice in its materiality, as a force that is available within every moment, every place, and every bit of matter. With their own tour de force, Barad mobilizes quantum field theory to break theory free from its exclusively linguistic, discursive, and disciplinary constraints. Importantly, this is not a moment of critique or negation, but of inventiveness, diffraction, and differentiated reinforcement. It provides the language and practice for a really radical program of deconstruction, namely as radical hospitality and as such attentive to matters of justice, as the infinite set of impossibilities for for materially reconfiguring worlds and past-future presents. It engages with the forces that language cannot speak or articulate. It demonstrates how deconstruction is at play not only in unsettling meaning in linguistic semantic force fields, but in the very articulation of the real. Reality, they write in their book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, is an ongoing dynamic of interactivity. In their diffractive reading of theories that are commonly kept apart by disciplinary boundaries, Barad convincingly shows that if deconstruction should matter differently, it cannot be a static method that gets applied to static contexts. It is not only, they argue, social and legal forces that matter to the workings of power, but that the social and legal cannot actually be addressed if we follow disciplinary habits of tracing disciplinary defined causes through the corresponding disciplinary defined effects. This is, they make clear, a question of ethics and of doing theory responsibly. How to theorize responsibly? First and foremost, by remaining responsive to the world in its differential becoming, and taking into account how meaning and matter are mutually articulated through reiterative interactions. In other words, Barad demonstrates that deconstruction can and has to incorporate that which it was meant to leave untouched: materiality, ontological relationality, forms of expression that depart from human language, and forces that penetrate and constitute the real. Making this argument, however, is no idle task. It not only requires coming to terms with the ontological indeterminacies at the very core of existence, but also to develop a conceptual and philosophical practice that does not seek to keep building the pillars of Western European Enlightenment philosophy. What is justice if not thought in relation to the Cartesian mind-matter dichotomy? How does it express itself, and how can we read and register it without relying on representationalism and the geometrical optics resulting from it? Is justice hospitable? Is it still meaningful without being grounded in anthropocentrism, or perhaps precisely because of an overcoming thereof? Can justice matter beyond the humanistic framework of ethical, legal, and philosophical thought? If so, to whom and or what? The void is not empty, silence is not mute, theory is not theoretical. Throughout their talk, Barad has shown how the operation of the concept of the void as absence, emptiness, nothingness, and we might add silence, goes hand in hand with an avoidance of responsibility. The dome walls in and covers up the violence of colonial practices and the forces of nuclear power. The walled-in silence of signification and deconstruction speaks to the imperialism of language and the force of law as interpretive force. This is not to compare nuclear force to the force of law, or the dome to the concept of a walled-in silence. There is no space for comparison, but the need for, and I quote, tuning our analytical instruments in a way that is sufficiently attentive to the details of the phenomenon we want to understand. Barad calls it diffractive reading. The stakes of reading forces are high. As Barad makes clear at the very beginning of their talk, theory and violence are inextricable. The theory and the bomb inhabit each other. At the same time, Barad reminds us, radical possibilities for exploring the structures of violence exist within theory. The practices of theorizing are not in vain, they matter. This is also what alarmed Derrida in his talk in 1989. Justice, deconstruction, is prone, even hospitable, to the most perverse appropriation. Yet it requires decisions, cuts that matter, and for which we must account. Thank you.
So that was intense. And I think I'm going to try to limit things given there's probably questions that want to be asked, but first to give you guys the opportunity to respond to each other perhaps before launching into something else. Well, since you spoke last, I'll allow Karen to go.
So, well, first of all, I just wanted to say that I'm not saying this in order to flatter you because you're going to give us our honoraria. This was absolutely the most, the richest response I've ever had to something that the talk that I've delivered. I think in the whole time I've been doing this, which is a long time, you can tell from my hair. So no, it was a really beautiful engagement, and yeah, that's all I can say is thank you. I'm just filled with gratitude in hearing that.
Thank you.
So where are we on the force of law question? 'Cause that seemed there was a little bit of Deridianing towards the end of both.
What do you mean? You jump in.
Well, first, let me start with the first question I think that maybe would be the most pertinent, which is the question of working methodologically. And the term diffractive reading was brought up, I believe, by Daniela towards the end of her talk, and this is the kind of thing you're instantiating in your presentation. But because the conference is partially about providing sort of young scholars ways to kind of do this work and be able to kind of read across and read through and read beyond siloed kinds of information that can be very frustrating, at least as I've experienced in my own work in the Atomic Project. If you could talk a little bit about that sort of method, as abstractly or as specifically as you can, as it would help the audience, I suppose.
Okay, sure. So first of all, in starting to speak about diffraction, I should also say something about what I'm inheriting. And it's not only Don Haraway's remark about diffraction in Modest Witness that was important to me, but the ways in which, as I try to acknowledge in a paper called Diffracting Diffraction, the work of Gloria Anzaldúa and other women of color, Trin Minh Ha, and so on and so forth, who are talking very much about how what I understand as being diffraction, at least as a physicist, it looks to me like diffraction. So when I was, retooling myself to be able to talk to people in the humanities, which was not an easy thing, I was trying to figure out, how am I going to, I didn't see these things as analogous, and how am I going to develop some kind of analytical tool to not only cross fields, but actually to respect the ontology that I was engaged with. So the ontology itself doesn't have a break between subject and object. So I can't, if I use a methodology that's going to break with the ontology, then I'm not going to get the fullness of what it is that I'm trying to capture, which are the entanglements. So for me, understanding diffraction as a quantum phenomenon, not just diffraction in the classical sense, but adding in the quantum physics, is about entanglements. Diffraction operates in that kind of way, and it was a repeating over and over again in the beginning about the two-slit experiment, because it's very much about the inseparability of object and subject and how they constitute one another through their interaction with one another, rather than being separate entities that interact. So similarly, if I want to engage with different subjects or whatever, I don't want to assume there's some pre-existing physics, there's some pre-existing Derrida, and somehow I'm going to find the right interpretation for either as yet a third point, as a self. At the same time, diffraction demands incredible precision. Like, actually, there are diffraction patterns all over the room. We're all, like what Stefan was pointing out in his amazing talk about waves. There are many waves waving all the time, but whether or not you can see them in any kind of way by looking at its spectrum, looking at individualized forms, depends upon a certain kind of precision and a certain kind of being with it, being in touch with it, a certain kind of, so a certain careful generosity of reading. I've spoken with my students a lot about not falling into the neoliberal trap of reading something, finding something wrong with it, and tossing it. But the importance of really trying to get what you can get out of it, and then see if you can work with that. So in some ways, my working, for example, with Derrida, I tried to demonstrate the diffractive methodology in the paper. But my working with Derrida is in some ways to make Derrida more Derridian. You know, that strange thing about being walled up and walled in, to me, when I first encountered that, I was like, wow, and then you guys brought attention to it. Like, I couldn't even believe that was Derrida saying that about the silence. And then the silence, of course, is not a pure silence. So in some ways and it's the same kind of thing with Bohr. Bohr had this insight that we are a part of that nature we seek to understand. But at some point, he falls down on the job about that. And I'm sure I do that as well with what I'm trying to do. So the point is there to try to carefully understand the theories and the different kinds of modes and what people will assume are different scales that don't belong in the same conversation, and we can talk about that. But to carefully read those things through one another in an attention to the differences and realizing that they're always already in touch is an important methodology for how I work. And that also goes to the question of scale, because how big is an atom when it's, you know, I hope that I've showed, the question of how big an atom is a question. It's in question. It's part of what's being questioned here. The whole question of scale can't be presumed. So it's about not being faithful to the masters, as it were, but being attentive and being careful. I think those are different kinds of ways of engaging.
So, in your particular work, because you are dealing with things, at least as a theoretical physicist of a certain scale, right? And then we have the kind of extremities of scale when it comes to the Manhattan Project, where, you know, you're demolishing entire cities. One of the questions that came up earlier in the first session today dealt with, when do you kind of know when a pattern sort of registers itself enough? Where is this moment where you're able to kind of capture, you know, the kind of produced relationality between things, especially if they're disparate? Is that a challenge? Is it something that you're trained to do in physics? How can you pause and capture something, or is it something that simply just emerges through making?
Well, I think part of my being able to do this work was undoing my training in physics. This is very much about my being able to think about the ways in which I was trained. But I think the question of the when and how do you know is it's an unending thing. It never ends. It keeps reiterating. The work is never done. And then at the same time, there's the ethical call to be part of it, to understand the ways in which we're part of it, and that we can help reconfigure space, time, and matter in ways that are more just, hopefully. But just not by not knowing what justice is beforehand.
Well, the Walden, you know, it's a, and if anyone's interested, there's this very kind of striking passage in the Force of Law where suddenly there's this kind of incomprehensibility with what to do with justice. It's called the incalculable kind of calculable. It never seems to resolve itself, which I think is one of the things that was running through both of the talks and trying to kind of release Derrida from this void he had gotten himself stuck in, essentially, I suppose. I could go on and talk about atomic bombs with you forever, but maybe we can do that in another time. So if anyone in the audience wants to, go for it, yeah. Sure, yeah. I don't see a mic.
Is Simona and Jane?
Yeah, let Jane go first.
Try to talk about. That was really great, both presentations, thanks. I guess the question is about the relative strengths of co-present ontologies. That's the fancy way of putting the point. But the sort of down-to-earth version of it is, I take it that the physicists who created the bombs had inhabited pretty richly the quantum ontology, and they applied it to matter
such that I think that, right, that's to make the bombs work. But they didn't seem to apply it to the model of self that you say comes from the quantum field theory ontology. The model of self that comes from that you beautifully pulled out was an entangled self, dispersed and diffracted throughout all time and space. If they had done that, they might have been less likely to drop the bomb on these other people. They would have thought of selves as being distributed and dispersed, and everything's connected to everything else in some quantum, complex, sophisticated understanding of quantum field theory, which I don't have. But I do get that sense of, at one point you said something like, matter is ongoing transformation and all of this sort of touchings all over the place. But they didn't apply it to self, but they applied it to matter. And what then happens is it seems like the ontology that swarmed in to determine or shape their activities were what you call colonialism, imperialism, racism, et cetera. So why did the ontologies of I am separate from you, you are over there, you are less than human, I am high human, you are low human, all the stuff that goes with that, why did that ontology trump the quantum ontology, which would have led them to a different conception of the one you bring forward?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Jane. And I was also just thinking I had missed part of responding to Zulaikha's question to me about the diffractive reading too, because what I need to say is every time I'm talking about physics, it's not like I'm just reading pure physics to you, right? Like, my giving over of physics is an agential realist interpretation of quantum physics. So first of all, quantum physics has many different interpretations that physicists argue about. Actually, in chapter 7 of my book, I actually put forward an agential realist interpretation of quantum physics. It's meant to be taken seriously, and it has been taken seriously by some physicists. So now I was very upset when it took so long for Duke University Press to get my book out. It took over 3 years too long. That was in the wake of the science wars. But one of the reasons was because there was this unique physics result in the book. And one of the reasons I put it in the book, rather than writing it up as a physics paper, is I wanted physicists to have to go to a feminist text in order to read this. And it was probably a silly dream and naive on my, except not, because last year I got invited to South Africa to talk with a group of physicists about this, but wasn't the fastest way to get that out there. So the thing is what is agential realism? And agential realism is not just Niels Bohr. Like some people, when they say, well, I'm doing agential realism, they go back to Niels Bohr and the two-slit experiment and everything, and I'm like, well, actually, I had to go to Niels Bohr and the two-slit experiment because this is my inheritance and my responsibility. And so, but what is agential realism is reading the quantum physics through the insights of Marxism and feminism and queer theory and post-colonial studies and critical race studies and so on. So I just wanted to say that that's the same kind of thing that I'm bringing you here in terms of quantum field theory. Now, quantum field theory is actually what I did for my dissertation. And I can tell you that I didn't hear any of this in my classes, except for the ways in which the renormalization works so that the bare particles actually get dressed by the vacuum kind of thing. That's actually the way I actually literally got taught. So what I'm trying to say is that there wasn't really a thinking in the midst of making the bomb about these deep issues of what it is that the theory's doing. In fact, one of the real exciting things to me about finally getting to do quantum field theory rather than quantum mechanics, like if quantum mechanics is strange, you can see quantum field theory is like, right? And quantum mechanics is actually, when people say quantum physics, they mean quantum mechanics, and it's one point on a very complex manifold. So I'm very excited, and I've been waiting a very long time to talk about my dissertation with people in the humanities. And that involves getting in there and trying to thoughtfully give voice to what these equations are saying in a way that, it's a kind of translation practice. in a way that I best can understand these things, and I wind up, it's very hard to speak these things, as you can see. And so the project is to do this kind of work. This is not the kind of work, you know, what people were doing was writing out equations, and hardly any words are spoken. Just equation after equation after equation, and then it becomes, you know, it's fascinating to me that this never gets talked about, because in quantum, when you learn about this subject in a physics department, they'll say, well, then the quantum field theory got interrupted by the war. And I'm like, well, actually, no. Actually, no. Why was it the exact same, let's slow down here, why was it the same physicists who were working on quantum field theory got called in to make the atomic bomb? And so how can, another part of this larger project is to actually show that the efforts at making the atomic bomb are also inside the theory itself. And so, yeah, the if only of, you know, doing science in a way that attends to questions of justice and not kind of a bioethics that is too little too late, but justice considerations in the doing of science, if only. So.
Just to be sure that I understood, you suggest that the quantum field theory had, let's say, a quantum of violence already in it that required expression, and that history in the 20th century simply brought the conditions for that violence to be expressed. And yet, anyone who's lay people and physicists who happen to be sometimes mesmerized or at least enchanted by the incredible developments in physics in the 20th century, partly because it was very, very beautiful, and partly because it was really about nature. It was also, they were discovering, if you like, extraordinary deep patterns which had never been conceptualized before. And there was also a very powerful set of, let's just say, directive intelligences in the case of people like Schrödinger, obviously Oppenheimer as well. These guys were reading the Vedantic literature, and they were engaging in some ways with their intuition. They were, you know, training themselves to think about the extension and energy in the world in an entirely new way. And it gave them a certain, let's say, access, which of course was exploited and ultimately resulted in the bomb. But does it really change the argument, or does it really change the fact that there was, that this is part of, that there was something extraordinarily beautiful before the bomb ruined the party that was going on?
I mean, the bomb as the sublime is certainly something
Well,
that is talked about a lot in the literature, for one thing. I mean, I think also you have to be careful about the different periods of time here when we're talking about quantum physics, and there was a different approach to talking about quantum mechanics by a different group of people than the majority of people who went on to work on the Manhattan Project. That was like the next generation, and there was a kind of way in which, when the center of physics moved across the Atlantic with a lot of physicists leaving Europe, many of whom were Jewish, is because there was a different settling and a different way in which physics then becomes a practice in the United States. Pragmatism takes over. The funding, how does physics get funded in the US? It's no longer the stakes are, you know, I have this philosophical background and I'd like to understand what I'm doing. It's now, I'm an experimentalist and I have some funds. You're a theorist. Give me numbers and we'll share grants. So it's this culture of what's called getting the numbers out, or shut up and calculate is another way to say that, which started in the move of physics across the Atlantic. And so, you know, Feynman, von Neumann, these other people talk about very much the kind of utter joy of making the bomb work, because it was this not only a calculational and a theoretical moment of amazement that they could do it, but it was an enormous engineering feat. I mean, it seemed totally improbable that they were actually going to make this work.
And you can imagine just the proximity, intellectual proximity to those forces, and the fact that they could manage them in their brains must have been truly, like you say, almost an ecstatic experience.
Can I say something? I mean, I know that like in some of the sort of supposed discourses of the sublime with the atomic bomb have been due to Oppenheimer, suggesting that he quoted, this text or that text when all he said was it worked when the Trinity detonation occurred. And then there was a series of military apparatuses that would kind of collect sublime images of continued bomb testings in the desert. And the same sort of magazines, like in Life, for instance, like Harry Eagleton and Berlin Brickstern, and these guys, they would publish these like full color spreads in Life, and they would never be in the same issues when they would show the photos of like dead bodies in Japan, or some of the more kind of like the striking photos in the deserts of the houses and the dummies getting sort of blasted. So but then in the late 70s, mid 80s, when many of these of the kind of violent images were declassified, suddenly there was a kind of apocalyptic dystopian response, and the sublime was finally kind of overturned. But I do think that was, I'm a little bit of a conspiracy theorist. I haven't been totally able to prove this yet, but this kind of managing to keep apart the kind of the visceral quality of images, I think, was part of the production of the supposed ecstasy, from what I've understood. Sorry. Oh yeah, and then people. Sima, please. Do you want to ask a question?
Thank you, all three, so much for this. I learned so much in this panel and in general. My question is about play. I wanted to ask more about play because I was reminded of the film we saw yesterday and the dogs playing and how they do it, and that there is this level of trust and this consent that precedes play. And the kind of playing host, obviously, they didn't really know how to play in kind of because there was no moment of consent and trust. And basically invading the Marshall Islands. So now I want to bring this question to the electrons and what they do and all the beautiful things that you showed us that they are doing, and the intimacies that develop between them. So I was wondering if this is a kind of play, or if it is not, and if not, then how does it differ?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, it's fun to be in conversation with the whole Cayenne thing, since watching that film was always like this moment of missing Cayenne. Yeah, the whole question of ethics is there, of course, for Donna Haraway, also in the question of play. And who gets to be playful when and on what conditions and so on is really a part of both of these conversations. Even though they seem to be dealing with play in very different ways. And your question about the playfulness of the electron, I mean, at one point I was trying so hard to express a kind of the wildness of the vacuum, which is how some physicists have talked about the unruliness. And I was trying to get that out there, and I think I used the word exuberant or something like that, and then somebody said to me, do you mean to me that it's all joyful? And I was like, no, exuberant's not the word that I want then. Because yes, it's not like it's pure play, even at the level of the electron. I don't presume, like touch is an extremely loaded political notion. And, there might be some ways in which it's important to get in there with the different kinds of forces that you can represent in quantum field theory. Like there's the gravitational force, the electromagnetic force, and two forces of the nucleus, the strong and the weak. Maybe what I ought to be doing is sitting down with the different forces and understand that there are certain kinds of touchings that are off limits in that regard, and really wouldn't take place. It would be not okay. It's part of the particularities of the different kinds of forces and the fields, and what a kind of responsiveness would be. So that's a wonderful question and something I might pursue. So I'll get your name afterwards, because if I go run with that, I want to give you the right credit. So it's a great question.
Professor? Or, sorry, for reasons.
I was really struck by this beautiful meditation on what a philosopher called the dual use problem. This notion that you can have something that's both a physical theory and then also a basis for constructing a weapon. And I was wondering if there's maybe a similar problem with the, you mentioned the science wars earlier, with the kind of theorization that led to that discussion. I guess what I'd like to ask you about is how I've read that some of the ideas that became very popular in kind of science and technology studies and other kind of forms of cultural studies have then sort of resurfaced in an illiberal politics in the present day. Do you see what I'm getting at?
You mean like Deleuze and Guattari's work being used by the Israeli Defense Forces, or is that what you're saying?
Oh, I don't know about this specific example, but I guess I'm thinking about somebody like Bruno Latour, who kind of made his career asking people to kind of engage with science and think about the importance of situatedness and perspectives. And now he's kind of forced to rethink the legacy of his work because they're climate science deniers and this sort of thing. So I'm wondering if there's a dual use problem that's a part of the theorization that you and others have dedicated their careers to.
An interesting question. I'm not so sure what you mean by dual use yet. I think that they're entangled with one another, so I'm not sure that I can flesh them out as how many there are. But what I take to be the spirit of your question is both, I mean, first of all, you don't know what people are going to do with your work, is one answer. But the question of actually this whole thing about facts, and this alleged post-facts and post-truth moment that we're allegedly here at, in some ways I think it's important to say, along with other people, we've always had post-truth, for one thing. But, I've heard Derrida accused, for example, of this, as if Derrida should be blamed for this particular kind of moment or something like that, like that the right reads Derrida, which I'm not sure that happens. But I do want to say something about the question of facts and so on, because as somebody who still thinks of themselves, whatever labels get attached to me, as doing feminist science studies. Feminist science studies from the get-go was really a project of redefining objectivity. And I think it'd be very, very helpful at this moment, because it's about, we have this center at UCSC called the Science and Justice Research Center that Jenny Reardon and Donna Haraway and I helped found. And it's about these, doing science responsibly, this question that is really relevant for all of us. And so the question of thinking through how one can make claims of the empirical but have a different empiricism. Not toss empiricism and facts and so on and so forth out the window, but I also have to temper something like March for Science, where March for Science is saying, protect our science. Here we're being attacked as scientists, and I'm like, okay, but this is a moment where if we're going to go for it, let's go for it and think about science and how science is being done. And there's an opportunity here inside this moment now, with all of its terrors and everything else, of saying, yes, there's a science, we want to say yes to a certain kind of science, we need there's, it's not just how I feel about the climate, or the fact that it's cold in a certain location, or any of these kinds of things. There's science behind it, but this is a moment where science needs to understand the ways in which there's always been politics inside of science. It's not like there's a divorce of the political and the scientific. And so it seems to me that there's a really ripe moment for a conversation there about moving this notion that we have to do science more responsibly forward.
I think Raviv wanted to ask the question.
Yeah. Something that in your initial response, you seem to have already been asked this question a lot, so I'll try to preload it. Because it was one of the things that I wrote down that has to do with the question of scale that Zulaikha was talking a little bit about. In the example of the radioactive isotope, there isn't a problem of showing the entanglements on all scales. So it starts within the subatomic and it goes out to the scale of cities and to bodies that are burned. So that kind of entanglement is, I would say, indisputable, and was incredibly detailed and interesting in what you're trying to redeem with it. So I think there's also kind of an attempt to take back physics in the best sense of the word by actually going through this kind of exorcism of how it's been entangled and re-entangled. So you're re-entangling it in a certain degree. But the scale jump more generally from the idea of these anything can be, which resonates, I think, with some of the things that Jane was bringing up and how we're thinking in our session about the possibility of the emergent. We seem to be excited about the same things, but when I work with acoustics, for instance, I often work with building scale. So when I scale up from the transduction, which is happening just in the magnetics and the DC flux that then goes out through another transducer that's going into the air, that air that's being vibrated that then rotates and changes in the room, there is a certain degree of unpredictability that has to do with setting up. So there's a certain knowledge that's applied, but then there's also a certain practice that goes in where the certain idea of what the signal was in the initial source no longer matches the experience of what's coming out. And I'm trying to wrap my head around something that for you seems to be very simple, the nimble jump from the subatomic to the human constellation of matter. So
Okay,
please.
Yeah. So I don't want to say there isn't scale, but scales get made. Scale is not just, you can't take this Russian doll notion of scales where the local is smaller than the citywide, is smaller than the nation, is smaller than the planetary. This is a reworking of space, time, and matter. Is one of the things to say is that quantum physics is really disrupting these questions so that I don't know what I mean by scale unless I'm talking about particular kinds of agential cuts such that I can make sense of scale. And that happens in practices like what you're engaged in doing, okay? But you can, on the one hand, in the very first part of your question, you admitted the fact that it was very compelling that the quantum physics isn't somehow only at the micro scale. And, somehow it, should be quarantined there. First of all, I have to say that, this is a question I get asked so much that I have like 15 different responses to, and I'm kind of tired of it, to tell you the truth. The whole thing is that like the, part of this, I think, is trying to quarantine the queerness. Like the world should be that queer, but only at the micro level, which I don't understand, because that's part of who we are, is the micro level too. But it shouldn't be that queer on the level of the social, It shouldn't be, it should just be these weird things that happen in the quantum level. But that would be to wall it in, which is precisely what doesn't work, is a certain kind of walling in for one thing. But for another thing, what we're talking about here also is the, the issues of the fact that the only thing that matters in terms of all of, like, Niels Bohr's philosophy, physics, and he talks about, by the way, quantum phenomena of the apparatus, which is macroscopic, and he says it has to be represented by a wave function. But all that's needed is that Planck's constant isn't zero. There's some discreteness to the nature of the world. It doesn't matter what size. And in fact, Bohr says, if only Planck's constant had been larger, we wouldn't have had these mistakes of epistemology where we assume that there's the subject on the one hand and the object on the other. We wouldn't have had that kind of epistemology based on a particular kind of ontology to begin with. So there are so many different ways of coming at this this kind of thing, but this is to say that I don't take it as some a priori that I know what scale is before things get started. I have to look at the forces, I have to look at the nature of the interactions and see how scale's being made, much the way people doing cultural geography would do, for example, and then, but that's going to take us looking at very particular phenomena and to see how what scale means, and for what uses, and according to what cuts, and so on and so forth. So how big is an electron? No, I mean that question quite seriously, given what I said. How big is an electron?
I think that it also relates to the edges of, so if we understand these distributions as being dynamic, then in fact there is not a moment. You only freeze it in a certain moment in a distribution. So it has a scale because you've stopped it at that moment of its, in its procedure, at least in the largest.
You have some material discursive practice by which I have some notion of scale that matters to me, and that by which I can do measurements and say, I'm measuring these kinds of frequencies and I'm amplifying it in these kinds of ways, and so on and so forth. And so, some people want to say, like, I'm telling them not to use certain words. I'm not telling anybody not to use any words. I just want to know what the apparatus is. In other words, I always want to ask the prior question, and in this case, it's the question of scale. How is scale being made, and for whom, and why? And why isn't that part of the question? Because those are also materializations and sedimentations of things that matter. So that has to be part of the analysis of what is a phenomenon rather than what is an object. It's an extension and further elaboration of Marx, where it's not just congealed labor of the human, but it's the congealing of all kinds of practices that are sedimenting, that are part of this glass that I have here that magically appears, as it were, right? If I do commodity fetishization. So I'm saying don't fetishize either scale or any of these. Let's unpack it and see what's behind it and how it gets made. Sorry if I was a little too...
Thanks. No, I already in your response, I knew that there was a reflexive. But the thing was, I think that it's not barricaded in, so the queered is already in what we're talking about as well, and the engendered is a million different ones, in fact, potentially. But it was just more on the level of the, if we're talking about these things as actual procedures, once the context changed and the procedure gets slightly different laws or different rules that... So that's what I was more wondering, can we jump? But you're saying that there's no such thing as scale, so then we don't actually, it's not a question or it's not a problem.
Well, it may be a question of jumping scales, but I have to know what scales are in a particular set of practices such that I can know if I'm even jumping scales.
Okay. Yeah, there's this power of tens that also comes in around the same time, where these things, which asserts a very specific kind of optics onto scale. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the
Thanks.
question. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you both for sharing your thoughts here. I'm curious to hear maybe also from Daniela. When you gave your response, you spoke about you raised the question of how can we think of justice when we want to think about it in a more material way. What are the limitations when we try to step out of the realm of the language. So in a sense, my question also to you would be, what are you thinking about where to draw from, what to think towards? What are the ideas? You said that this would be a very good moment for an intervention of thinking through how do we do science, where is the politics in the science, how can we do science in a different way? So I would like to hear from both of you a little bit, if you could speak a little more about the directions what are the notions that you are with to make the step towards a different kind of engagement that holds the notion of justice somehow, or where you locate for you this idea of justice.
Okay. As you know, I'm working more on law than on justice. It was more through Karen's new way of reading justice that I kind of came to think about it again. But I think, for example, no matter the scale right now, but the way let me start again. For example, a gentle cut, like in Karen Barad's work, a certain notion of that there are decisions or there are cuts, and I might be implicated in them as a human subject or not, but that there are certain decisions and cuts that are made that include and exclude things, beings, matters. It's very important for me when thinking about law, because law is about inclusion, exclusion. At least we are told it is about that. And rethinking that, for example, in terms of, let's say, legal subjectivity, who or what can be a legal subject? Can it be human or not? Does it have to be similar to the human or not? One way to rethink law would be, can we think about this cut differently? Can we think about legal subjectivity in terms of a gentle realism? Can we think about it in terms of individuation? So there's no entity given, and yet questions of legal subjectivity has to be negotiated. And for me, what Karen Barad is also doing, and what I'm using, is trying to find a different, not even canon, a different way of thinking, or referring to different works, or unreading or rereading of certain works they're never quoted. For example, why do we have to go back to Kant or Hegel? And we can, but why do we have to? What about, I'm interested in Spinoza, in Whitehead, in Bergson, in Barad, in Bradodi, many
Deleuze.
of the Deleuze and
Yeah,
Guattari,
yeah.
especially the combination.
Right, yeah.
So if you think about law in a different way, in this kind of a completely different tradition than the whole legal system on which the West relies, especially North Europe and North America, would change. So this is what interests me mostly in law, which might lead to justice. I don't know.
In terms of the science and justice question, we're actually, I'm the director of this training program where we try to bring people together, grad students from all divisions of the university, engineering, natural sciences, humanities, arts, and the social sciences. And the idea is to bring everybody together at the lab bench, where these kinds of, facts are being made together with values. As I alluded to real quickly, the traditional notion, and there are some people who are contesting this within the field of bioethics, but this notion that, where ethics and science are about is the scientist goes and does whatever the scientist is going to do, and then hands it off, and then that person looks at the ethical uses and misuses, those possibilities, the ethical, legal, and social implications is what it used to be called, of science is too little too late. So the point here is to get everybody together, even before you're at the lab bench, and say, why is that important? Why is that the thing that you want to be asking? Why is the question, what causes homosexuality? And there isn't a question of what causes heterosexuality. All of these kinds of things. So to bring people together with very different kinds of training in order to get the questions of justice on the table together with thinking about how things are going to be measured, how you're going to do the project, how you're going to do the calculation. So not just in the interpretation of facts, but as feminist science studies scholars have emphasized, at every layer of the onion, there are these questions that need to be examined. So it's a matter of, you know, breaking through the disciplines, the disciplining of knowledge, where the sciences somehow get to sit above it all. And UCSC campus, they're on Science Hill, and it spills down from there. You know.
Mitch, did you have a question?
I just had a quick reading question. You know, what math to read? You know, you mentioned Whitehead. I thought Whitehead would become a, you know, but sort of what, you know, to the extent that sometimes we're talking about translation here, right? To the extent that maybe we can directly read mathematics, even in a kind of dilettante kind of way. I was a fan of Mariam Marzakhani's work on the manifold, even though it was way over my head, right? But is there kind of mathematics that we can read to continue accessing this, maybe outside of this kind of problem of the imperialism of language that came up in the response?
One of the wonderful things, of course, in terms of mathematics now is Denise De Silva's work. But let me just mention, because I think you're also asking the question in terms of mathematical skills. And I like that question a lot, because I think that what people are very hesitant about in doing this kind of work is not becoming literate enough in the science, but depending upon the scientist to tell them what it is that they're doing and take it from there. But not only are the scientists not very reflexive about what they're doing, but also they've learned to speak to the public in particular kinds of ways that is about highlighting what you're doing and making it look so profound no funder could resist. You know what I mean? So then you tell yourself the story about what I'm not saying that this is like something scientists wake up in the morning, they think, oh, I should make sure I answer this question in this particular way to get funding when I talk to the public or when I talk to kids in elementary school, when I go do the science night thing or whatever else. But I'm just saying, I think there's so much more work that can be done about questions of justice within the science by actually getting into the mathematics and the other technologies of actually doing the science, and not it just always being the scientist as the translator for the object world, the ventriloquist for the object world, I think is what my colleague Donna once called it. So, yeah, I think it's very important to do that. And if you want, we can have a conversation afterwards about particular areas that you might be interested in. But a lot of times I'll have students who are in the sciences take some of the courses in feminist science studies and feminist studies, and they'll say, okay, I've had it with science. And I'm like, no, please don't leave. Please do this there. Please, you know, bring these questions into the science. So I would be more than happy to talk with you about your interests and about particular mathematical skills. But I think it's really important what you just asked.
Oh, sorry. I was taking notes. Yes, in the back.
You can start.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the program you just described sounds great, because just personally, I dropped out of a physics degree the day that the lecturer opened the session on electrostatics by talking about all its industrial applications and how that was the most important thing that we would take away from his element of the degree. So yeah, but I guess I had a different question, which was about, this is a kind of naive question from a physics dropout, but the way in which you related quantum field entanglements and the kind of paradoxical way in which we theorize the electron, or even the electron as a placeholder for something that we can't access or really ontologically observe, I guess. You know, so resonates to some extent, or I wonder, does it resonate with other sort of insights from mathematics like Gödel and undecidability and the kind of limits of what can be described with mathematical language? And if so, I mean, I'm interested in how you conceive of that theoretical apparatus and its versus like some ontology or some ontological rail that might be inaccessible to us as sensing beings. I don't know, is there something beyond the sort of the theory, or do we take the theory quite seriously on its own terms, just in terms of how you're linking it to undecidabilities and deconstruction and that kind of theoretical work? I don't know if that makes sense.
Since we just discussed the fact that we're out of time, should we just have the second question
I'm sorry.
as well, and then?
Question?
I'm interested in, or curious about the layers of the onion that you were referring to earlier, particularly thinking about the implications for the infinities of the electron once that electron is embedded in current through a wire within a computer, within a system. So really just curious about your thoughts on the implications once these queer particles are part of engineered systems, whatever we might take that to mean.
And what's the question exactly? I get the engineered part, the way in which.
I'm curious in the way that, or about how the implications of all of those embedded, already always becomings of the electron change once they are part of these larger systems. How does, attempts at human control over these things, how is it implicated in the quantum field theory itself?
Okay, I was hoping these questions overlapped a bit more so that I could just, do this at once. I mean, the question of incompleteness in terms of Gödel's theorem is actually a different question than indeterminacy that's at root of in terms of the quantum physics. Yeah, so we could talk about that more if there's a conversation to be had between incompleteness and indeterminacy. The question, yes, certainly, we're also made of electrons. We forget that. And atoms and nuclei. So the thing is that, yeah, certain kinds of things we control. We control the flow of people, we control the flow of rivers, we control the flow of electrons. But I think that it doesn't take away from the fact that what's so important, and what I take to be very much on Derrida's mind in terms of questions of hospitality, is when we're drawing these lines in the sand between us and them, okay? Or down at the, making walls, whether, it's Israel, Palestine, or Mexico, the US, or, we're constricting flows and everything else, but what we're talking about here is a certain way of understanding the possibilities for undoing certain kinds of forms of control, whether it's electrons or people or rivers. How do we think about engagement that's not about making things do a certain kind of work, outside of questions of responsibility, but through questions of erasure and avoidance and things like that?
I've been instructed to happily conclude the session with a round of applause.